Hey, what's going on, everybody? Today we have a very good problem for you guys called insert interval. This is a very good problem, so make sure to pay close attention to the problem statement, right? All right. So it says we're given in non-overlapping intervals, right? Where intervals of I has an start and an end, right? Uh, so it represents the if interval and intervals, right? It's sorted in ascending order by start time. Okay, so we're given this new interval, right? We're going to start and end, right? So that represents the start and end time of another interval. Okay, so insert the new interval into intervals such that the intervals are still sorted in ascending order by start time, and intervals still does not have any overlapping intervals, right? So merge overlapping intervals if necessary, right? So return intervals after the insertion. Okay. Note that you don't have to modify intervals in place. You can make a new array and return it, right? So this is a very good problem, guys, right? So what they're telling us is pretty much we're given this intervals, right? Start and end, right, for each interval. So now we're also given this new interval, right? And we need to insert it into intervals, right? So originally the intervals, right, they're non-overlapping and they're sorted by their start time, right? So we need to return it after adding the new interval into there, and that same it still has that same constraint, right? Still non-overlapping, and they are still in their sorted manner, and by sorted by their start time, right? So we can't just mess up the array, just put in the array, with all the things being merged and not being good at all, right? We can't do that, right? So we have to be very, very clever about it, and yeah, so that's exactly what we're gonna do. We're gonna go to my drawing board and start coming up with ways to kind of solve this problem, right? So you can see that we have this new intervals. We got 1, 3, 6, 9, right? And this new interval 2, 5, right? So what I did was I drew it on the whiteboard. And now we have the dashed intervals, right? Represents the new interval that needs to be added, right? We could easily see this by, the intervals, right? So since we need to return it in non-overlapping, right? Also, we need to merge intervals that overlap, right? And pretty much put them into one big interval, right? If that's the case, right? So for this particular example, right, where we could visually see it that the two intervals that overlap, right, is 1 and 5, 1, 3, and 2, 5, right? The new interval and the first interval overlap because 2 is inside, right? And 2, 5, right? 2 started and be in between 1 and 3, right? So that's where we can easily, just put them into merge them together, right? After being merged, right, it becomes 1 and 5, right? So the merging happens. We choose the minimum start time, right, and the maximum end time, right, because we want to grow it as big as we can, right? It's pretty logical here. That's why we choose the far left possible start and the right most possible end, right? That's kind of what we do. We overlap into to make it as big as we can, right? Okay, so we have 1, 5, and then we have 6 and 9, right? Because they don't overlap, we just return them as is, and that's will be our answer for this one, right? Just one pretty straightforward, right? Not a lot going on, but I think the second one, right, has a lot going on, and we're gonna have to it's gonna help us in kind of crafting the algorithm of choice, right? So I drew them again, and I have the dash interval to represent the new interval that needs to be added, essentially, right? So we have 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, right? So we have those things, right? So now we can see that all the overlapping intervals, right, just by eyeballing it, pretty much, right? We see that 3 and 5 overlaps, 6, 7 overlaps, 8, 10 overlaps as well, right? So um, 3 and 5, right, we can see that, overlap because uh, partial intervals in between 4 and 8, right? So from 4 to 5, it's inside of 4 to 8, right? So or overlaps, right? So 6 and 7, another that 4 and 8 completely overlaps it, right? 8 and 10 overlap because this started, right at this ending, right? So this it counts as overlapping, right? So that's kind of what we have this, right? And that's why the answer is is from 3 to 10, right? 3 to 10, right? That's the big interval that gets created after we merge, right? And I told you, the way we go about it, we merge, right? We choose the far left possible start time, right? And then we choose the rightmost possible end time. Okay, so that's kind of how we end up with this, right? So to complete it, right? It'll be 1 and 2, right? Since 1 and 2 doesn't overlap, right? We add it as is, right? Right? This is not to scale, right? So we have 12 to 16 doesn't overlap, so we just go ahead and add it there. As simple as that, right? So what are a few things that we can observe, right? We can see that uh, there are a couple cases that we need to handle, right? So the first case, that's pretty much the easy one, right? So intervals that ended before the new interval started, right? Right? For example, 1 and 2, right, ended way before 4, right, started, before 8 started, right? So there's no overlap in any possible way, right? Because it ended before it started. So how could it overlap, right? It's like having a meeting from 1 to 2 and a meeting for 4 to 8, right? There's no overlap here, right? No conflict at all, right? So you can just add it to the thing, right? The result, right? So now we have our second case, right? Which is the most important case right there, right? Or we have some overlaps, right? For example, right? So now that we've taken care of all the intervals that ended before, right, the new interval started, what's left are intervals that ended, right? So so no, I meant to say, so we're taking care of all the intervals that ended before the interval started, right? So what's left are intervals that ended um ended after this new interval, right? So we know that they're ending after, right? Since we've already filtered out all the intervals that ended before the new interval started, right? So all the intervals that are left are intervals that ended after um, this started, right? Okay, so there might be potential overlaps, right? So now how are we going to check the overlaps, right? Okay, the overlaps are going to be checked by, checking, right? So for this particular interval, right, does it end, right? Or did it start? I meant to say, right? Did it start before I ended, right? If it started before I ended, then there's a potential overlap, right? Because we know that it ends after I started, right? Okay, so that way that I'm asking the question, right? Did it start before I ended, right? So if it started before I ended, right, then that means there's a potential overlap, right? So it handles all the cases, right? So cases, for example, right? Let's say, for example, we have 3 and 5, right? So 3 started before this ended, right? Okay, so either so it can't be 3, it can't be 2, 3, right? Because we would have filtered that out, right? Because if it ended before I started, then there's no overlap at all, right? So we know that it's ending after I started for sure, right? Okay, that's a known fact. So knowing that, right, we can uh check. Only question I need to ask now, right? Did it start before I ended? Right? If it started before I ended, then either I have the 3 and 5, right, where it partially overlap a little bit, right? Or we have an example where we have 3 to like 100, right? Uh, it still started before I ended, right? And there's overlap as well. That's another case. It overlaps as well, right? So if there's any time it started, right? So there's a meeting from uh, 3 to 5, right? And I already have a meeting from 4 to 8. There's an overlap right there. So we go ahead and overlap, right? So it becomes, right, 3 to 8, guys, right? This is a temporary, right? So we do 3 to 8, and then that's how we have this 3 to 8, right? We keep checking every time with that new interval, with all the intervals, right, to see if there's any overlap as well. The same question, guys, right? So we keep asking, did it start before I ended? Yes, 6 started before I ended, so it gets merged as well, right? Okay, and that's why it becomes 3 and 8, because this is it completely overlaps this one, right? And then we get to this one. It's at the border, right? So at that particular time, it's from 3 to 8, right? It becomes, since it overlaps, right, it becomes even greater, guys, right? Because we asked the same question: did it start before I ended, right? Before I ended, right? It started exactly at where that ended, right? So it has to be, the condition is going to be less than or equal to, right? That will be our condition, because we have to handle that case where it's at the exact border as when I ended, right? So those count as being like, conflict, right? So we merge them together, it becomes 3 and 10, guys, right? So now that we have that, I mean, we go to 12, 16, right? We ask, did it start before I ended? Nope, it did not start before I ended. It actually started after I ended. So there's no overlap at all, right? So we go ahead and add all the remaining intervals that are left, right? We don't have to worry about doing any overlapping thing because the intervals given to us were already non-overlapping, right? So they're not going to overlap, right? So we don't have to worry about that. We just add them as is, right? So that's the third case, right? So the first case is to handle those intervals that started before. No, that take care of all the intervals that ended before the new interval even started, right? So there's no things to worry about. And then the second one is to find all the overlapping intervals, right? Because after we filter out all the intervals that ended before I started, all the things that are left are intervals that ended after this particular new interval started, right? And that's why we keep checking this new interval. Did it start before I ended? Then if it is, then there's a potential overlap. That's why we do the merger right there, guys, right? We put them into a bigger interval, right? Okay, so let's quickly go ahead with the code. I think it'll make more sense for you guys once we go ahead and start writing it, right? So we're going to have an index, right? This is the pointer is going to help us to iterate through the list, right? We're going to have our the lists here, guys, right? New array list. So make sure you guys understand what I was doing. So what we're going to do is to do a while loop, right? Just to iterate through the list while the index is less than, so let's quickly capture the length of the intervals. Okay, so less than n. And so it's less, so we can go out of bounds. And then we're going to check this new interval, right? All right, so what did we say here, guys, right? So the first stage is to end all the cases where that we're saying, right? We want to filter out the cases where, the interval ended before the new interval even started, right? So if that's the case, what we're going to do is to just add the interval as is, guys, right? So intervals, next, right? We just put it in there. Simple as that, guys, right? And then what's next for us now, right, is to now do the second phase, right, where there's we merge any interval that overlaps with the new interval that we're about to add right now, right? So exactly what we're gonna take care of right now. So we're gonna do this while loop. All right. So make sure that we stay in bounds. That's kind of what the reason why. So the interval index. We're gonna come back to that. And we said new interval of so now what did we say before, right? So now we're taking care of all the intervals that ended before, right? This statement started. So now we're left with intervals that ended after this started, right? So now we're gonna check, right? So for those intervals, the start time, right? Did it start before this new interval ended, right? So if that's the case, then that's a potential overlap, guys, right? Because we went through the cases where, we can encounter when we see those intervals that started before the new interval ended, right? But didn't finish before this started, right? So those cases, they overlap, guys, right? Okay. So how do we do the merging, right? The merging happens by picking the leftmost value and the rightmost value, right? So the leftmost start and the rightmost end, right? Because we want to get the biggest interval that we can get, right? So it's kind of what we're doing here. Okay, pretty much merging it into adding that data into the new interval, right? Pretty much morphing it into one, guys. It's kind of the main takeaway here. Okay. So now intervals index, we do the same thing here, guys. Simple as that. Now we're going to do the same thing for the right side, guys, right? Which is the end time. Instead of the min, we get the maximum because we want the rightmost value. So the biggest value you can get, right? So we go ahead and morph it into this one interval where we keep merging as much as we can. That's kind of the thing we want to do here, okay? And then after that, what's next is to go ahead and add this new interval into our output list, right? So we've taken care of that case. We're basically pretty much done, right? So what's left for us are all the intervals that didn't overlap. We go ahead and add all the remaining ones here, okay? So we add them, and what's next for us is to just, yeah, like I said, add them straight up, okay? And next plus. And also we have to make sure that we increment the pointer each time as well, right? As we're going through the list, okay? Looks good so far. So what's left for us, guys, to return the output result, right? This is just us turning it into the desired format, right? Which is the array, right? Instead of array list. So we're pretty much done. I meant to do size here. Okay. Uh, okay, so we're pretty much done. Let's press if we pass the small test cases, guys, right? So enter. So I spelled it wrong. Intervals. Let's press. Oh yeah, it was being spelled wrong. Let's see. I don't know why I kept doing that. I spell it right most of the time, but yeah. So let's press go again. I think it looks good so far. Let's press submit, guys. Awesome, guys. We would pass all these test cases. If you guys found value, guys, understood the thought process in the comment section. If you guys are new, make sure to subscribe because we'll be doing a lot of other videos just like this one. So I want to thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.